So David, welcome back. I'm delighted we get a second chance to speak. This time we're going to focus on the future of warfare. So thank you for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question is a segue of sorts from our last conversation where we were talking about your book, History's Fools. And we were talking a lot about philosophy and theory. And I want to segue from that. We were talking, just to remind my students, we were talking about the progressive liberal consensus, as you call it, and how that has failed to manage our peace and prosperity at both domestic and international levels. And you talk a lot about international relations theories. That's where I want to start this discussion about the future of warfare. So you write in the book about how international relations theory has failed. How has international relations theory contributed to changes in international conflict particularly, and what does that imply for the future?
Yeah, I think what I try to understand really in the book is how there was this end of history moment that seemed to promise only democracy, globalization, interconnection, and that the costs of becoming part of that world, this globalized, interneted, interconnected arrangement, meant you either got on board with democracy and the international understandings that went with that, human rights, open markets or relatively open markets, open borders, and that the package was dynamic, transformative, and progressive. And so there were a number of writers that promoted this, not so much Fukuyama, more Thomas Friedman, classically in The Lexus and the Olive Tree. But then within international relations theory, it became the understanding, from the 90s onwards, with particularly coming out of those associated with Blair's Third Way as a philosophy, and the Third Way as it was envisaged by those around Clinton in the 90s, was that major war between states was no longer feasible. So the idea of heavy investments in a grand strategy, for instance, or in the military capacity was less and less necessary. Europe became the classic exemplification of this, spending next to nothing of its GDP on military or defense infrastructure, whilst expending a lot on social services and international aid. And the assumption was war is passé. The future is liberal, inclusive, multilateral, and multicultural. And this can all be brought in to what international relations theory considered either a normative order following a Habermasian communicative reason that would extend discourse between neglected others and the more powerful Western democracies to inculcate or create a normative arrangement that was more just, more emancipatory, and required, obviously, distributions from the West to make this thing acceptable to those who'd been left out of the process. But the process was Western-led, but accepting of difference, ideally, but that there was no alternative to this international normative development. And it assumed a teleology, a rather simplistic teleology, an almost Whig view of history, that the state now that had led, the effective market states of Western Europe and America, which had delivered a crushing blow to totalitarian or authoritarian alternatives, needed itself somehow to disappear and dissolve itself into an internationally ordered arrangement, which would follow some kind of Kantian imperative, where the theory of democratic peace understood that no democracies ever fight, and that as the world democratized and internationalized and followed international rules rather than state interests, this happy land of an international paradise would eventually occur. Meanwhile, on the fringes, there were the odd problems. Terrorism, the breakdown in the Balkans, the rise of proto-Islamism in its various manifestations following the fall of the Soviet regime in Afghanistan. All these were problematic, perhaps, but they didn't deviate from the march of history in this teleological process. And all it would require in terms of interventions was never major war, but the odd police action to sort it out, which is initially how presumably Afghanistan started out, and Iraq, but turned into something far more messy and from which we are still recovering. So the doctrine that went with this liberal epistemology and its normative understanding also might require intervention, but intervention was always not sort of in terms of a major war, theoretically, but in terms of a humanitarian intervention. So you had these, around 2008-9, you had these brilliant defensives of Petraeus-style counterinsurgency, big coin, showing the Marines coming in and bringing welfare packages with them of aid to stabilize these unfortunate regimes that had fallen foul of the teleological progress which internationalism promised.
Yeah, so have we learned anything from the recent 2 decades of the triumph of progressive liberal thinking on international relations theory? Is what you're describing as our recent past, is that our future too?
Well, there was obviously a pushback, which like Trump symbolizes, Brexit to some extent, the rise of populism in Europe. But in terms of an overarching Western understanding, it's still there, and it's obviously coming back with Obama 2.0 in Washington at the moment. The understanding seems we are back to, this kind of understanding that a sort of John Eikenberry view of the world, that liberal institutionalism, despite a setback, will now be reanimated. America will again, work closely with NATO. We'll see the European Union as another beacon on the hill, that it can operate in the Indo-Pacific through an alliance of democracies, and the world will come back to the normative setting that it should have had after 2000, really. But for the blip in Iraq and Afghanistan, we would have been on this international normative journey, and further up the road to universal polyarchy. So in the West, it's still there, but there are, obviously critics emerging even in the West, like you and myself. Not that we get, too much publicity, but also, you can see that Asia is no longer influenced by this vision. There was a moment when, even at its outset, there was a Singapore school in the 90s that thought, imposing Western values was never going to work on Asian societies with very different cultural understandings. The rise of China and its increasing assertive irredentist nationalism, the return of a sort of authoritarian Russian sense of a greater Russia, the Iranian potential to exert a kind of quasi-theological autocracy in the Middle East and Middle Asia. All these factors now make that liberal dream seem increasingly deluded, I would have thought, for anybody taking a step back and looking at it from a relatively recent contemporary history perspective.
Yeah. So let me push you to be predictive here, because you talked about the new Biden administration looks like Obama 2.0. It's got a lot of the same people in it. Samantha Power, the new Treasury Secretary. Sorry?
Blinken, Anthony Blinken.
Yeah, Blinken. I'm thinking of the new Treasury Secretary is Obama's former Federal Reserve. Yeah. So it is Obama 2.0. And in that sense, you can be predictive that it's going to be like Obama 2.0. But at the same time, the people within it and within the broader progressive liberal consensus are quite contradictory about how they're going to handle the intermediate blip, which is the Trump single term administration. For instance, on never-ending wars. So before Trump, progressives were saying, we've got to end our never-ending wars, and this is a Republican problem. And yet, once Trump wound down these wars, Syria and most recently Afghanistan particularly, the same progressives were saying, whoa, this is irresponsible. We've got to stay there and finish the mission, which is pretty much what they were criticizing George W. Bush for saying. And we should, if we look further back, progressive liberals tend to have a liberal interventionist norm, or I don't know if you call it a norm or a pathology even, where they talk a lot about we are the peaceful end of the political spectrum, but they're also very belligerent under the name of liberal interventionism. So they're going to democratize and they're going to liberalize, and it makes them actually historically more belligerent than the Republicans in the American case that they're criticizing. So it's actually quite difficult to predict how conflictual the world is going to be under Obama 2.0. So before we turn to China in particular, can I just push you to be predictive on how conflictual you think the Biden administration will be?
Well, I think it'd be interesting to look at how it plays the relationship with the UK, depending on the nature of Brexit, given Blinken's profoundly Europhile sensibilities and the fact that Merkel was always seen as the inheritor of the Obama, kind of legacy in the world after the end of the democratic order, the Democrat Party's role in American politics with the end of Obama and the rise of Trump. So Merkel was a sort of the light that would carry on the this liberal order. So we got how America will reinforce Europe is going to be interesting, and how it plays the UK and its alleged special relationship. And this will have effects on, Kerry's back in the game as well. John Kerry, who famously went to Ukraine in, when was it, 2014, I think, to say, we'll be with you all the way against an irredentist Russia, and then was not present as Ukraine was, effectively partitioned.
And he was also similarly contradictory on Syria. So
absolutely, yeah.
at the beginning of that conflict, John Kerry was very belligerent about Syria. You use chemical weapons or you harm your own people, we're going to intervene, and it's going to be really bad news. And then Assad did it anyway, and then nothing happened.
Yeah. So I mean, that sort of liberal interventionary kind of schizophrenia, really. On the one hand, it's like talking the talk and not walking the walk. As Kissinger said, you should speak softly and carry a big stick in international relations.
Yeah, hang on. Wasn't that Teddy Roosevelt? Wasn't that Teddy Roosevelt?
Wasn't it Roosevelt? Sorry, I had it from Kissinger, but Teddy Roosevelt would be better. Actually.
Yeah, don't give too much credit to Kissinger for that.
But I think that kind of liberal establishment does the opposite. It thinks rhetoric has an impact without force behind it, and that's certainly been the way in Europe, which is rhetorically Habermasian and full of communicative reason and understanding of the other. But when it comes to the use of force, it's negligible. It's Merkel's read a lot, but she's never read Frederick the Great, who said conducting international relations or international politics without military capacity is like having an orchestra without instruments. And that's the problem with Europe at the moment. It's been mugged by the rise of the revisionist powers, particularly Russia. But as you say, the other aspect where this liberalism talks a lot, but then fails to do anything, is the Middle East. So and then the other aspect, which is going to be very interesting, is the reopening of a potential deal with Iran at the expense of what was Trump's policy of moving back to a more Sunni-oriented foreign policy in the Middle East, and obviously pro-Israel. So I think there are two aspects of this. One, it talks the language of international rules-based order, which it clearly wants long term, and is not, something that we should, sort of dissent from too much. Rules-based order is a good thing. However, how you get there is the problem, and who you're going to get into bed with and who you're going to kick out of bed is going to be very interesting, and how you might make grand claims but don't follow them up is always a problem from anybody who's read, Machiavelli. If you're making big claims and then you don't follow them through, you look weak, and you're seen to be weak. And the trouble with the liberal, interventionist position is it talks big, then does little, then intervenes, and at a very expensive cost. It does not do prudence or pragmatism, and that's probably its abiding problem.
Mhm. And also, I think implicit in what you're saying is it's incremental too. So it tends to talk a lot and then come in late, and
That's
not particularly committed when it comes in late, and then it incrementally has to invest more and more
yeah,
in, but never investing a lot enough to be decisive. And so it's very expensive. You have these long wars, they're ultimately indecisive, or you satisfice for an incremental change which actually doesn't solve the structural problems.
exactly. Yeah, and you can see, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria being, classic cases of that, which really need to be, seriously reinterrogated. How that mess of all that sort of incredible lack of proportionality in the long term came out of an idealism in the first place, which, coming back to the initial point, comes out of this theory that has proved so detrimental as a postulate from which to operate in a world that doesn't follow a timetable set by Kant.
Yeah. So I think you're concluding, you are predicting that the world will be not necessarily more conflictual, but certainly inefficiently conflictual. So we're going to perpetuate conflict by not solving it efficiently. So in the long term, this is going to be presumably beyond a single term of a presidency. In the long term, we're looking at a more conflictual world. Is that more conflictual world? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it depends how the Biden administration goes and how effective it is in building up its alliance structures, or its reinvigorating multinational institutions. Are they already vanishing arrangements like the United Nations, like NATO, like even the European Union? Are they investing in something that is fading from the world? I mean, these institutions, bodies, politics come and go. So are they making, should they really, if they were being properly radical and interrogative, thinking, as Pompeo was tending to do in his last weeks or last months, of creating new arrangements, new arrangements that could give more stability and more coherence to those countries that might not actually share this liberal end of history, or the liberal internationalism, but are very invested in being successful, balanced political arrangements that are basically on side with the idea that they want a rules-based order, both economically, politically, and internationally, but don't want to play into any necessarily ideological agenda that the Americans might have. So there's potential, obviously, for a Biden administration to reinvigorate something, particularly amongst the Western democracies, which certainly needs, would be, something positive. On the other hand, if they're just going to go with the tried and failed mechanisms and institutions, we are in for more conflict. But I think that there are elements in the Biden administration that do realize the problem that China and Russia potentially represent, and they are potentially, they could potentially do or follow on from Trump without obviously acknowledging Trump in ways that might present China with a few problems going forward, which probably needs to happen both from a European perspective and an American perspective, and from an Australian, Japanese, and an Indian perspective. So if they could bring that together in some kind of new forum, that might be a productive engagement. But we are increasingly looking at a form of containing China, which nobody wants to kind of officially say, because whether it was Obama or before that Bush, we were always trying to shape China's emergence following, as we know, a Kissingerian understanding.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. So let's turn on to the process of war. So what will warfare look like? And if I may, can we start with artificial intelligence, which I know you've written a lot about. So what will be the impact of artificial intelligence on how war is waged?
Well, I mean, there's obviously the technology that AI brings in, for cyber and disinformation on one level. The use of drones, drones have been hugely impactful on how you can conduct warfare without, expending personnel. So the expansion of drone warfare, the area in which space will now play an increasingly crucial role in terms of how we coordinate any kind of strategic action against a perceived enemy. So the idea of just the idea of the battle space has been transformed by AI, without going into the use of robots beyond drones in conducting military operations. So AI is going to transform warfare. The speed of interventions that against Saddam, for instance, back in 2003, and before that in the 1990s, the high tempo kineticism was brought about by computers. Now with the transformation of AI, the conduct of warfare will be on levels that we still haven't properly got our heads around, I think.
Yeah. So what other technologies then would you think are transformative? I don't know if you want to talk about some capabilities I've dealt with in other discussions, but to give you an example, there's a big debate about the future of the tank. So some forces such as the Marine Corps, United States Marine Corps, are divesting tanks. Britain is officially committed to upgrading them, but still is unclear whether that means an incremental upgrade to the legacy Challenger 2 or a whole new tank. France and Germany are cooperating on a new tank, supposedly, but there's a lot of pushback against that. No, that's not appropriate. So you don't have to talk about the tank, but maybe we can talk about legacy platforms, any that occur to you that should be abandoned or maybe should be reconfigured.
Well, I think we're looking at from the British perspective and probably from an American perspective, Europe has got a different problem because it's a land, it's part of the world continent. So its land-based force and how it coordinates that might still require tanks, but how effective they'd be, I mean, air power and drone power and the potential that drones can, which we, you know, there's been not enough attention to the radical reorientation of, you know, capacity that the drone has made and how that's configured. If you were talking about a major, say, conflict that involved European forces in, say, a clash either with, shall we say, you know, Turkey or Russia, which would be the most evident one. What would be the key technologies that would be involved there? Well, AI would be very important here, and it would be important on a number of platforms, not just in terms of, you know, coordinating your military. Misinformation, disinformation would be crucial in this this space, and we do not give enough attention to the, you know, the manner in which Russia, particularly, has been able to use its disinformation and you know, its media hacking abilities, which are, you know, not just that Russia can use, as China uses its ability in on the internet through AI to capture technologies in ways that we've seemed to be very slow to respond to. So we're already in a kind of a battle space, you know, in terms of information warfare. That will, you know, that's something we should be attending to a lot more carefully. And that would apply, you know, not just to, you know, a conventional war situation. It's now, you know, deeply embedded in things like, you know, financial manipulation, fraud, the taking of technologies through either, you know, sort of hacking or by, you know, infiltrating Russia or China into developing technologies that are taking place in Europe, the UK, or the US. This is already something that's occurring that we're not sufficiently strategically wise to. The Chinese are, and so are the Russians. Why are we being so slow? You know.
Yeah, well, there's a nice segue there to a theory we haven't talked about yet, and this is probably more within my wheelhouse. But you know, democratic victory theory contains, so that's a derivation from democratic peace theory. So democracies tend to win wars, but they win wars in particular ways. So they don't necessarily win them outright, but they, you know, they win them in ways that they can satisfy. So they withdraw, and then they get coded as at least not defeat. So they victory or draws. They win or they draw, but they don't lose. So at least we can say democracies don't lose. But one of the implications in my own theory is that democracies prefer remote forms of warfare because they don't want boots on the ground. They don't want high casualties because of electoral punishment for casualties. So they like remote. So they like ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, aircraft. They don't like armies. They don't like ground forces. They like artillery on the ground. They don't like infantry on the ground. And if they're going to have infantry, then they're going to be highly mechanized and highly armored and all the rest of it. So this is possibly within my own wheelhouse, but you know, but is that not an explanation for why the West still isn't adapting? They're not adapting their forces for the sort of conflicts that you're talking about.
I think that's well, you know, to come back to that point about, you know, the role of the military. I mean, the UK is and I suppose, you know, those who've been influenced by the UK, like Australia and Canada, has always emphasized its naval role rather than its army. You know, it goes back, and some of that goes back to the 17th century. You know, Britain or England never liked standing armies. It smacked of French absolutism or Prussian militarism. So, in a sense, you know, the armed military is something that you want a professional army, a limited army that can serve for an integrated posture, which is always concerned with defending the integrity of the state and its lines of communication, which requires a powerful navy. And I think the one of what I was thinking of, you know, working on it, you know, recently, is how China is obviously focused on what Mackinder called the world continent, as it's rolls out its Belt and Road Initiative, not only in Asia, but across to Europe as well. And following on from that into Africa, where it's seeing, you know, so China could dominate the world continent in ways that Europe is beginning to kind of be aware of. The Britain's strategy is obviously to go back to somebody like Corbett in the, you know, and the idea that you've got a naval capacity that's permanently, you know, in situ on the world's oceans, potentially working obviously with the American fleets, you know, and in that way, the world continent is contained, and you've got this, you know, kind of evolving conflict between the maritime states, which would involve Australia, obviously, as well, maybe parts of Southeast Asia, Japan, India would come into the mix, and the United States and Canada, and the you know, the central powers on the world continent. That's my configuration of the world at the moment. Cyber and AI will obviously play heavily into that. You know, whether you know, if it came to major war, which probably I don't think China would be. It's too pragmatic, perhaps, to consider that. China follows Sun Tzu. You know, it does it through massive capacity that overawes you eventually, and then you give up. It's not likely to be able to do that in the near future. So, but the one consideration in a major war situation would be, you know, how effective are aircraft carriers going to be if you've now got other capacities, cyber, drone, etc., that could wipe out your floating basis.
Yeah,
you know.
and also very long range shore-based anti-ship missiles, which is the particular concern in China's near seas. Now, having said that, Britain's just invested heavily in 2 new aircraft carriers, and yeah, we've just had a spending review which has favoured the Navy.
Yes.
With the support vessels you need to send a carrier long distances at least. And after the Navy, it's the Air Force. The Air Force has new aircraft too. So it's fulfilling the pathology, that the democratic and the British pathology that you've just described. I'm not sure that the British MOD, Ministry of Defence, has published anything in the public domain that justifies its confidence in aircraft carriers despite these threats.
No. Well, I think you know, it's still living with the idea that these, you know, platforms are going to be, you know, useful. I mean, obviously, in terms of policing the seas without major, you know, conflict, they're highly credible as an integrated maritime platforms. However, you could. I mean, the other aspect of all this, that, as Victor Davis Hanson has argued on Carnage and Culture, what the West is good at is major battle. It's good at a disciplined fighting force, infused by a common belief in the mission, and to achieve it by kinetic force, quick, sharp, and you either win, or at least you usually fight it overseas, as you said. You prefer it at distance, and that kind of understanding of warfare is now being eroded by the idea of proxy war, I think. So what will not, there won't be a direct conflict between China and the US over I can't see, there might be something that happens in the South China Sea, which could spark things, but the most likely way of taking out an aircraft carrier, say, in the Indian Ocean, would be through a proxy, a terrorist proxy or some other proxy that had got the technology from, say, China or North Korea, and used it without having an obvious, area from which it came.
Or a cyber attack, which
which
I know the United States Navy is very concerned about, as in actively working very hard to protect against that. I'm not sure about European navies particularly, but certainly the US is. So cyber proxy war, and I frankly would like to see more public discussion about this, because while our colleagues are talking a lot about the same old abstract international relations theories, I don't think they get into the technical and the practical much.
No, I think that's very important, as you say, and it's also the way in which globalization has both been positive, in terms of trade, but now there's such a kickback against it, partly because our societies are now, our open societies are so penetrable by these malign technologies that we've in fact invented. It's a sort of a Pandora's box to mess with us ourselves. And so not only is it that sort of the operations of misinformation and disinformation, the buying out, or the kind of manner in which our leading tech stocks or tech companies can be infiltrated and taken. Arm Holdings is a classic example. Its Chinese branch has been basically taken over by the Chinese state. I mean, how stupid are we to allow that? Major microprocessor. So these things are not talked about and not discussed enough. Both in America and in Australia, they've got foreign investment boards that try some oversight over, what might be malign state takeovers, but they've been, pretty inept with China, for instance. Australia and China, Australia left itself wide open to be, used by China, manipulated by China. And when it tries to push back over, perfectly legitimate question of where did COVID come from, it's been forced, it's being subjected to this classic China strategy of carrot and stick. And at the moment, it's getting the stick big time. But, the Foreign Investment Board in Australia never, closely examined what China was buying up in Australia, particularly its rare earths, which are going to be central for a new battery technology future, So the way in which the West has allowed its crucial technologies, which they think are free to the world and will always be used benignly, have been, so naive, really. And that's the lack of any kind of, within the universities, paying attention to it only in science departments, maybe, which are only interested in, the effects of, what they've discovered as a, major grant getting opportunity, rather than, what are the geostrategic implications of this, and why aren't, international studies departments thinking about the uses of technology, both good and bad, as we did in the 50s and 60s, I think, in ways that we've been overtaken by this sort of slipshod, simplistic IR ideology that's left us, failing to see the links between scientific and technological advance and politics and state building and state, undermining, really.
Yeah, and as you explain in your book, History's Fools, related to that is that academics have rejected working with government. So we're talking about the 60s, the partnership between government and academia in defense was very strong, and it's practically impossible. So some universities ban government defense work, so they'll take government money, but they won't take it for defense.
Yeah, they'll take the large ESRC grants to study gender awareness in
right,
and LGBT guidelines for the military, but they won't sort of participate in the dark arts of
like real security, practical security, rather than ideational security, you might call it. Right? All right, thank you, David. So my last question for you is about space, because so bear with me. I think this is where History's Fools is most it's implicitly most insightful, in this sense that space has been a rule-based domain. It's been demilitarized, and those rules have been respected. So space is the final domain which is being militarized. So now the United States has a space command. Britain in November just committed to having its own space command. So the military is actively acquiring systems to defend its assets in space, whereas the previous militarization was essentially surveillance from space, and there were certainly covert attempts to prepare for knocking down those surveillance assets from the ground, but sometimes from other satellites. Now, the prospect is that we're going to be more overtly military in space. Now, that's where I think your book, History's Fools, really has most implication, because you've talked about how the progressive liberal consensus wants a rules-based order, but cyberspace and space, we can talk about cyberspace as well as near-Earth space, they're both really difficult in practical terms to impose rules or police the rules. They're very difficult to police, and they seem to be getting more wild. So how will a near-term progressive liberal resurgence under the Biden administration, at least in a short term of 4 years, what do you foresee for near Earth space? And then maybe we can include cyberspace, this conflict, this apparent, not conflict, apparent contradiction between a rules-based ideal and practical militarization.
Yeah, well, good question. I think, I mean, the evolution of space, both cyberspace and the space, the final frontier, had always assumed that it would be under Western technological guidance. That's so that Western norms, or so-called universal norms, would apply. That the big technology, NASA was the big space center. Its European offshoots. We had space, basically. The only time that it wasn't, Western space was the Soviet Union, and there was big concern if we go back to the 50s with Yuri Gagarin being the first man in space, and the whole idea of the first to get to the moon had obviously huge symbolic resonances, but the Soviet space mission, failed because the Soviet economy failed ultimately. But always there had been a tension about space, I think. It went away at the end of the Cold War. We thought that space could be regulated just like land, or like our treatment of those areas of the planet that seems to be under, no country's immediate domain, like the North Pole or Antarctica, that we would all manage those resources in a kind of an international framework. Similarly, space, following what would be a rules-based order. But just as with Antarctica and the Arctic, these understandings are falling apart. Russia has now claimed the Arctic, I think, or most of it has put, and it wants to explore its resources, which we previously said, we would keep this as a nature zone. Similarly, in space, it's becoming more and more crowded with competing platforms. And particularly, of course, not so much the Soviet Union, which has still a very significant space program, but China as well. So China has got a big space interest, and not just from an exploratory perspective, but from a military perspective. And I think what's only happened, and we're still not, again, in the public conscience, space is seen in, kind of Starship Enterprise terms and Star Trek, whereas the military dimension of space, the exploratory nature of space, and sending missions to Mars, sort of Elon Musk sending us, to colonize Mars because he apparently fears what will be robotic wars on planet Earth. So we've got this sort of idea of space as this sort of interesting exploratory frontier for knowledge, but we don't think of it so much in its power dynamic terms and the way in which space can be manipulated for control of Earth-based militaries and interventions. And one of the areas, of course, that China and Russia is deeply concerned about is the area of space that the West has used very, creatively and usefully, which was the Five Eyes community, which obviously in terms of intelligence gathering, it's been a hugely useful resource. China will be, no doubt, trying to build an alternative and to interfere with our Five Eyes, capacity. So what happens in space, what happens with AI, is potentially another revolution in military affairs, as is the dimension of cybersecurity and cyber war.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. Now, is there anything you think we should have discussed that is?
Well, I suppose the only other thing, in terms of warfare and the dimensions that the classic Western model of force on force war has to adjust to is disease. We've had COVID-19, which may or may not have come out of a laboratory in Wuhan. But what we know is that the impact of COVID-19 has been so huge that anybody thinking of how to disrupt a society will be looking at biological weaponry very closely.
That's a very good point. And I'm not sure governments have fully engaged with that.
On that depressing note.
I think we ended our last conversation on a somewhat depressing note. Yeah. Well, we've admitted to each other.
Well, at least we've got a vaccine now, so maybe it's.
Yeah, that's a separate discussion. I'm not, as you know, I'm not that confident in the efficacy of the vaccine yet. We have to see more evidence on that. But the implication of what you're saying is governments need to increase their capacity for responding to weaponized pathogens and responding quicker and having alternative counters to the spread of a pathogen than national lockdown, which is just ultimately in a war situation, you would be literally doing the enemy's job for them by shutting down the economy.
Well, this is exactly precisely, I would have thought, the lesson that China has taken from this, as well as Russia.
Yeah,
how effective it was, and we didn't even plan it.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you for another very stimulating discussion. David Martin Jones, author of History's Fools, The Pursuit of Idealism and the Revenge of Politics. Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.